Let not each beauty everywhere be spied. Where half the skill is decently to hide, he gains all points who pleasingly confounds, surprises, varies, and conceals the bounds. We have that now written in one of our structures on the garden, and in a way it's kind of the philosophy of this garden.
We were married in 1949 and rented a house in Boston for a while. Had a little garden there, a place for a garden, and I decided I'd try to garden it. And I needed help, so I made him help me. And he wasn't very interested. After that, he had a business failure in New York, and he was sort of discouraged by that and decided he'd get out of the business world. And so he came up here, and I started doing gardening.
In some of what my father's aims to do with the garden were, rather than be didactic and teach people about plants, he wanted to move people. I think that my father was an artist first.
He was a sort of patrician character, very much a Cabot, upper-class American, enormous charm, and also a very strong French feeling, which perhaps did come from living in Canada. I don't know what a genius really is, but very often geniuses are a little mad as well. And if he hadn't had a lot of money, you might have said he was.
I think in part, the desire to plunge into gardening in middle age was the consequence of having a lot of business troubles. I'd had reverses, I'd had some successes, I had some reverses. The reverses were painful enough so that they made a major effect, and I felt that I had to prove that I could do something right after them. And gardening seemed to be a natural avenue to pursue. So it was really that, I think, that got me into it. I see visiting a garden as basically an emotional and sensual experience, as well as something that is filled with surprise. Really, to visit a garden is a special thing. It's not, you just don't go through it looking at what you see. You really should do it alone or with maybe one sympathetic friend who doesn't talk too much. It's awful to have people talking while you're going through a garden if you're a real garden visitor. And I must say I've learned about visiting garden by watching people go through this garden. And the good ones, they look at things quietly and drink them in, and they think about them. And they begin to, in a way, have a conversation with the garden. And they listen to what it's saying to them. I think one is always attached to the places where you spend your childhood in the summers. And I grew up here. I was born in 1925, and the next summer I was here. I've been here every summer of my life since then, as my parents, grandparents, and even great-grandparents before me. The first member of the family arrived here in 1842 to escape an epidemic of cholera in Quebec, and spent the summer on this place down by the beach. And he got very fond of it. When he married, he came and lived in Pointe-au-Pitre in the very early tourist days of the community. And then ended up building a house around the turn of the century, across the way. And then in 1902, bought this property. Anticosti Island was put up for auction, and it had 7 salmon rivers on it. And he was very interested in buying that, so he made a bid, but he lost out to Mr. Chocolat Menier, the chocolate king of France. And he was very upset at that, and he was in the Garrison Club in Quebec, drowning his sorrows, when he ran into his childhood friend who owned this place, and who said, oh, stop grumbling, you can buy my place for $50,000. In those days, it consisted of 90 square miles, if you can believe it. And so his eldest daughter was given the house that was on this property.
I think everybody in my family, since 1842, has felt connected in some way to this place in Charlevoix, the original seigneury farm of the Mount Murray Seigneury.
Au temps où les cabottes se sont installées, on est en 1902, quand la seigneurie est achetée par George Bonner, c'était un pays éminemment champêtre. La population était constituée d'artisans, bien sûr, menuisiers, charpentiers, forgerons, etc., d'agriculteurs, de marins, de forestiers. Et tous ces gens-là vivaient beaucoup plus simplement que nous, c'est bien évident. Les bateaux à vapeur commencent à sillonner le fleuve à peu près au milieu du 19e siècle. Et c'est comme ça que, par exemple, en 1890, un monsieur qui s'appelle William Howard Taft et qui sera le président des États-Unis vient avec Madame Taft faire l'excursion du Saguenay, s'arrête à la Malbaie ou à Pointe-au-Pitre et, séduit par le lieu, et décide d'y revenir. Il est évident que l'arrivée de quelqu'un d'aussi important va inciter d'autres personnes à suivre son exemple, et c'est une des raisons qui fait qu'on va créer une sorte de colonie d'estivants américains à la Malbaie.
The original house was built in 1928. It burnt down 3 months after my father's death in 1956. He was hit by a stroke of lightning. And he had raised the insurance on the house from $50,000 to $100,000 Canadian 6 months before his death. So I've always thought, well, he was giving my mother something to do. So she had a ball. She decided to have a much grander house than it was originally, and ended up with this rather pretentious French house that we have now, which we would never have built by ourselves, but which is a joy to live in. And so she put a garden right in front of the house, between the house and the view. But she had a brother who was an architect. And he came up and to stay for the first time. And he said, well, you've done the wrong thing. You never should put a garden between you and the view. So that was an important lesson.
Le premier souci des gens qui construisaient ou faisaient construire une villa était de trouver un point de vue exceptionnel. C'est pourquoi elles sont souvent juchées sur la falaise et regardent le fleuve. En même temps, ces gens-là tenaient à être un peu isolés, donc souvent leur villa est entourée de bois. Et souvent aussi, elles disposent de jardins. Il est évident que le jardin des 4 vents est quelque chose d'absolument spécial, puisque ce n'est pas un jardin de villa, c'est un des plus beaux jardins du monde, et il est considéré comme tel.
For me, Frank Cabot was always somebody whose garden I wanted to see, and I never got a chance to do so until about 15 or 16 years ago, when I met some people who knew him quite well, and they said, well, we'll introduce you to Frank Cabot and you can look at the garden. When you first come to this garden, you are absolutely knocked out by the way in which he's used the over 20 acres that he has. And this area, after all, was created for everywhere from Les Éboulements to here, was created by an asteroid. That's what caused the hills to come up and so on. And I think we have that magic feeling that this was created out of time and space.
The first blossoms in any garden, of course, are the early spring bulbs. And this is an ideal spot for them. And so we have the narcissus, the daffodils, which are lovely. And once they're over, you get a form of thermopsis, maybe Thermopsis caroliniana, a wonderful yellow, tall yellow blooming prairie plant or field plant. And of course, the apotheosis of the whole effect is when the lupin come up and you get all these varied colors. So you have a period from the end of April to the end of June, really, when the place just blows your mind. And very few people see it in the early stages, but it's a lovely, lovely part of the garden.
The apple orchard, for instance, in the spring is filled with 10,000 bulbs. So, you know, you have the apple trees in blossom and you have the grape hyacinths followed by the daffodils, you know, followed by tulips in the orchard. So all around is the bounty of nature, and then there is what a human being can create out of that nature and out of what the plants have become when they become domesticated. My grandmother was an avid gardener, and so was my mother.
And so spending the summers up here over time, I was exposed to gardens in a big way. And when we got up here in '65 and it was become our place, we didn't do anything for 10 years, really. My mother had started a garden here in the early 1930s.
And then we inherited the house, and I thought, the place, I should say, that we would not keep it because we had a house in New York. So I thought he'd sell it. And I was mistaken. The next thing I knew, lock, stock, and barrel, we all moved up here for the summer. No, I mean, I remember my mother saying, whither thou goest, I will go. And that's what you do with a husband. I had horses, and so he said, well, let's bring the horses up. And then there were very few places to ride. We just had a big trail around the woods. And so I said to Frank, would we make some trails? So he started making trails. And he loved doing that. And so that's what happened for many years before he got into the garden.
During that period, we had a chance to visit the gardens of Europe and England particularly, and suddenly began to realize what the potential was. In part, this was due to the fact that we were protected. The land was large enough around us to protect us. No one could build something right next door. And that meant that the landscape was intact and wouldn't change, which is very important. So we began to think we could have a more interesting garden. And also the topography was lovely, the views were lovely. The climate is marvelous for horticulture here. Most people don't realize that because we're way up in Zone 4, and people think, well, you're too far north, but being by the St. Lawrence, you have wonderful snow cover and rain, and it's never too hot. And perennials love that. Another feature that makes it interesting is that they all bloom at the same time, which makes you look brilliant because you plant it, and the next thing you know, everything looks wonderful. And we began in about 1975 to enlarge the garden in a series of steps without any real sense of where it was going. I mean, we just had an idea at a time. The French have a saying, "Le nuit pour conseil." You go to bed wrestling with a problem, and when you wake up the next morning, you often have the answer. So I felt that you could say for this place that the site tells you what to do if you listen. And the important thing is to listen.
It's the first thing you see is how it fits into the landscape. And you would design completely different gardens depending on what the surroundings were. And of course, the soil, the climate, and everything all comes into it.
What I think is special about this is it's one man's vision. It's one person's vision. It's one soul. And that makes it very, very special. But this kind of creating of beauty that they have done here at Les Quatre Vents is to make you feel that you are plunged into the heart of everything that could possibly be grown. And I think that's what makes the garden unique, because of the gardener's sensibility behind it.
When we started, there was a 180-degree view from the house towards the west. And you could see everything. You could see the whole Cordillera of the Laurentians in the background. We thought, well, let's hide the distant fields and make it more intimate and make rooms. And the first thing we did was put a kind of herb garden facing the kitchen. And then we thought, well, the custom up here in this part of Quebec and Charlevoix counties to have these wonderful clay bread ovens. And we had one of those on the place, so we thought, well, why not stick that opposite the dining room so you could look out at it? And finally, the next one was opposite the guest room, so we thought we'd have a guest room. So we created a kind of living room of furniture. And there's a little cup garden in one corner of it, around a little roche fleureuse, a rock with water coming out through it, and moss, and a little round pool. And there's a banquette, pretend banquette, where you could sit and have cocktails if you needed.
When you're in the guest bedroom, there's the Roche Pleureuse, the Weeping Rock. And it is a fantastic place to shed the cares of the world. If you concentrate on the slightly moving water, the reflection in the sun, the world washes away and goes down to nothing. And you become focused in the garden. But the minute you get out onto the tapis vert, all of a sudden, it's as if the curtain went up and you had a huge experience waiting for you, including the Laurentians and the cattle and the view and everything else.
So you have a very sudden, episodic structure to the garden, where you go from one space to the next, very suddenly, with very little transition. And this provides a real frisson of delight, surprise, variety in the visitor. And I think that's what he enjoyed.
And I think that those palate cleansers, if you will, the green rondelle after the goose allée and before the watercourse and the rigidity of the thuya cones everywhere, that those were really intentional sort of entr'actes, if you will, between the various set pieces that were theatrically intended to provide a lot of variety.
I saw a picture of a water course in a famous garden in England, done by a famous landscape architect called Geoffrey Jellicoe, where water steps down very slowly in a series of basins. And it was just an inspiring kind of feeling. I thought, well, this is a gentle slope down to a little lake, and this would be a good place for it. It emanates at the top of a sort of thuya alley and then steps down gradually in basins until it ends in a little lake. Well, you know, water animates a garden. It's that element which just gives it so much more interest. It's just something happening all the time. There's sound, When we started the whole garden that consists of the Rondelle and the great Thuya Alley and everything, the interesting thing is that we elected to top the trees as they descended the slope at the same level. So you've got a level line as these trees go down the slope. And I think that helps the whole, that enhances the distance. And your eye is carried down through this line of tall cedars, shaped cedars, to the little lake, to a sod bridge which crosses the lake and which is right on axis, and then up through the arch to the view. As we did these steps and then went on to create what's known as the stream garden, I saw a photo in a calendar of an arch in the Royal Mughal Gardens in the Governor's Palace in New Delhi. And so I thought, well, why wouldn't that be a good thing to do here? The trouble was that we just finished building the stream garden, and none of the trees were more than 4 or 5 feet high. And this thing was like 30-something feet high. So it stuck out in a terrible way. It upset my wife terribly.
I thought it was a bit much. What was he doing that for? It just didn't seem to me to make any sense.
So he's not a perfect designer, but it's possibly that because he wasn't a trained designer, that's made it so exciting. Because if it's obvious and very well designed like a French garden, it's in a way quite boring too. I'm not trying to detract from his genius at all, just that it's made it a little bit eccentric, which he was, an eccentric. I think it's really true, you know, and a genius, or nearly a genius.
Alleys and focal points are a classic garden feature used over the ages in all civilizations. And they serve, in a sense, to shut out part of the view, so to channel the view to a specific spot, so you can keep having them over and over as you see different views. They give great strength to the garden.
And that meant that you went from point to point, and usually there was something to see, and very often there was a view out into the much wilder landscape, and of course contrast is wonderful. I can't really think of another American garden that contains the feeling of wildness which Frank managed to keep, I think, by having these views through.
The stream garden is a stroll garden. You go up, walk up one side of the stream, and then you walk down the other side. Across the way, when you're at the trees, you look and you see the first glimpse of a wonderful plant that we use a lot in the garden called Petasites japonicus, Japanese butterbur, giganteus. They're dramatic green leaves. And so we've used them throughout the garden. And on your right, suddenly you see a Chinese moon bridge, which is very decorative and is particularly interesting at different times of the year. And it's a moon bridge because it makes a perfect circle in its reflection in the water.
I love the Chinese bridge, but of course, again, it was isolated there above the stream. It was one theme, and then that was finished. You can turn it upside down. The reflection is so perfect in the pool below, which he designed the pool. And that was part of his aim, to do that, and enormously effective.
The greatest quality Frank brings to a garden is his ability to visualize what it will be like. And that's, I think, what makes a gardener, what separates a gardener, a real gardener, from just somebody who can use a garden or would like to have a pretty decor. That's not what Frank's Garden's about. It's not about a pretty decor. It's about a whole way of being and expressing through nature. And you get to a place where people, quartet, can play music together in a gazebo. And then beyond it, you see fields and mountains, and you see the beauty of Charleroi.
Gardens have to do with sensuality. All of our senses are involved. They play a very important role in one's reaction to a garden. And so the breeze in the leaves, you hear the leaves shaking, and you smell the fragrance of the flowers, and you get turned on by all these things happening. So I think that you can't go wrong if you emphasize the sensual elements in your garden when you make it.
There is this sudden delight at the surprise in front of you. The thing has changed. You seem to be in a completely different world. And as you penetrate deeper into the garden, you genuinely feel as if you're on a slightly different plane of existence.
After doing the stream garden, we decided that we'd start working on the shade borders, which were along the edge of a woodland, and it took a long while to get it just right. Patience is very important in gardening. You can't rush things. You just got to wait and let things develop on their own. And that's a very important point. Get much more fun as you watch things change, and they change for the better, and all sorts of new things happen that you didn't expect.
If you have a perennial garden, you have to plan it so that there's something in flower or in its best position every 2 weeks, because they don't last all summer. But in this garden, where you see an astilbe garden next to a lily garden, next to roses, etc., that's because they come in waves, and some of the waves intersect and some of them don't. So you have all these timings. It's very coordinated, and I think it's orchestral almost. It's like music.
I like to think of the garden as a kind of a series of musical themes, like a sonata, and building to a kind of horticultural climax in our case, at the end of July, when the delphiniums reach for the sky and when everything's moving its head off. So I think of it as sort of a horticultural symphony.
What I love the most about the garden these days is the reaction of people when I take them on a tour. It's always different. And I just love the variety of being in a work of art that's not static. It's always active. It's always changing. It's always got something new to say.
You're never at the end of anything in Frank's Garden. You can't come to something you think, oh, there's just a cedar bush there. I don't think I can go into it. No, there's suddenly a path there.
I consider myself a world-class plagiarist, and at one point in our lives, my wife and I had the great fun of taking treks in the Himalayas with a wonderful man called Tony Schilling, who was a great English horticulturist. And he had a wonderful ravine, which he planted with all sorts of Himalayan plants. And he'd said, you know, I've always wanted to have a rope bridge crossing this ravine. So I said, aha, you've given me an idea. And 2 weeks later, we had a swinging bridge. As an emotional experience, the ravine adds an unorthodox one of fear to the mix.
He ended up with those 2 little rope bridges, 2 big rope bridges, focusing at a central point at a little kiosk in the garden. And that kiosk was jokingly referred to as the cocktail kiosk, because you could then go across the bridge, have a drink, and then really be wavy on the bridge coming back the other bridge. At that point, that was the end of the garden. There was no pigeonnier at all.
And this was a very separate area from the rest of the garden. You didn't see it from any other place, so you could do pretty much what you wanted. And I'd been struck by the idea of a water feature with a tall building at the end of it. You see that quite often in Europe. Then, of course, there's the Taj Mahal. Why not? Well, I came across this sketch of a pigeonnier in the place called Gourdon, in the district of Lot in France. And so I thought, well, let's have something like that. And it could be a very formal element to the garden. Won't impinge on any of the other elements. It'll be a surprise. And that's fun, to have surprises. So that's what happened, and it took us a long time. It took about 15 years to do it.
The thing that my father was most interested in, I think, in his garden was the effect that it had on individual people. That's why it's laid out so theatrically. He wanted very much to have people have a series of experiences. The way he says it, it was, you know, you want to have as many emotions as you can.
Because he was a very emotional man, I think, and he wanted to make people feel something.
And they get this shot of the pigeonnier with its basin in front of it, and they go, oh, wow, my goodness. And so that's exciting. It's because they've discovered something, and in a sense, really isn't going around the garden that consists of the joy of discovery, the surprises, excitement, the humor, but essentially discovering for oneself these new things without preparation. And they have another surprise as they do that, because as they walk into this palisade, they suddenly see a gray wolf looking at them from across the way, and they go like this. So another element to get the juices going and get them thinking.
Well, he couldn't use water. He used mirrors to reflect, so you doubled the sense of space. And that's what reflection did, of course. It doubled everything that you were looking at. And these were the sort of things that Frank was interested in.
And you enjoy it, or you dislike it, or you are entertained by it, or you are emotionally wrung by it. Nothing makes me happier than seeing someone burst into tears when they're looking at a certain feature of the garden, and it Why does that happen? It reminds them of themselves, of their own families, their own loved ones, those that are no longer alive. Gardens satisfy a need in humans, I think, that not everybody recognizes or has, but when they do, it's a marvelous experience. And I like to think this garden does that for people.
One of the things that first happened to me in memories that I have of the garden is of a birthday party, mine, I think. And my grandmother had put a little note card on the lily pads in the white garden. It was magic from the fairies. They had come to the garden. And apparently she'd done that for him as well in the garden when he was a child. That kind of experience, without really knowing the horticulture, sort of defines a magic, a heightened awareness of what a place can be. And it sticks with you.
I think gardens should be fun, too. It's nice to have a sense of whimsy. People should be entertained, and their emotions should be wrung. So I like to think that if people go around this garden, by the time they're through, all their emotions will have been exercised a bit.
There's so many different ways of looking at a garden. It can be mystical, it can be theatrical. And for somebody like Frank, it's a theatre thing. He loved that, and the drama. Yes, it's garden theatre at its best.
When you arrive in the center of the pigeonnier, how are you going to get into this door and this cylinder? And I urge them to think of their childhood. And almost everybody says very quickly, "Open sesame," or "Ouvre toi sésame," and magically the door opens.
And you go upstairs into the tower, and there's china there, which has been made to complement the gardens here. Everything is of a whole.
So as you climb the stairs to the pigeonnier, suddenly you realize you're in this fantastically beautiful Swedish room, which has a Swedish stove in it, and fantastic botanical prints on the walls. And it's a very intimate place, but it's in the trees. So that when you look out, you feel like you're a bird in the trees, and you're looking down on the reflection pool. And so beautiful, but totally surprising to find in the middle of a garden. It's what a true folly should be.
And then from that room, you can go up further into the tower, and you come upon a nid d'amour, which is a very important part of every garden should have a nid d'amour, in my theory. And that is exciting because it looks like a Swedish castle, and not everybody gets in there, but those who are invited in enjoy it.
Not only is it about planting and about color, but it is also about humor. It is about playfulness. It is about joy. It is about all kinds of things which you would never imagine is just about gardening. It's about these areas that he's created where he has frog musicians playing. One is Dixieland, the other one is classical.
I mean, nearly all the features, the themes that he's used in all these different areas evolved from something he'd seen or read. But he then added to it the wonderful frog bands and the music coming on as you walked through. I mean, all these wonderful touches. He also had this extraordinary sense of humor, which definitely came into his gardening. I've really seen a lot of gardens, but Frank's garden has got to see this extra touch of genius, which you could argue with him about. I mean, I never did sit down and say, why did you really do your Japanese garden? He'd spent some time in Japan, so he really wanted to do it. You know, so I didn't always agree with him about everything, but it was still amazing what he did, do you know?
I wasn't aware that it was there, and I heard this knocking noise. This hollow, well, it's a bamboo tube being knocked. It's a deer scarer, which is a key element of Japanese garden design. And then just the sheer delight of seeing it, I'll never forget coming across it, this pristine Japanese tea house.
I was stationed in Japan just at the end of the war. We landed on the beach near Kobe just as the armistice was being signed in landing craft, and walked up the beach to find Japanese ladies beautifully dressed in kimonos selling Suntory Scotch whiskey, specially blended for the U.S. occupation forces. I did have a chance to visit the great gardens of Nara and Kyoto, and the impact is extraordinary, especially in autumn. So I had a feeling for that. So we thought, well, here in Quatre-Vaux, we have this ravine, which is always been there, and there was an old water reservoir, down at the bottom of it. Why wouldn't that be a logical and ideal place for some sort of a Japanese structure? So that's how it happened. Then we had to find a Japanese carpenter who knew what he was doing. But to my surprise, 2 years later, suddenly the phone rang, and someone in California was saying, the man you're looking for is here, and I'm going to put his American wife on the phone because he doesn't speak English. So I said, well, when do we begin? And they said, well, you have to be patient. We have to find the trees, which we'll do in Northern California and Southern Oregon, cut them. I have to dry them in my backyard. That will take 2 years. It will take another year to do the joinery, another 2 years to do the joinery, because there's no nails used in a Japanese structure. It's all done with mortise and tenon. It's an extraordinary exercise. They said 4 years from now, we'll come and we'll erect these buildings, and the two of them, and that will take 3 summers.
One year we came, and we had a Japanese person here building this tea house. And the Japanese person stayed for as many months as it took to build the tea house. But all the logs were wrapped still. And at the moment when the house was finished, the paper was taken off the logs. The reason is that all the logs had to age at the same time. So the kind of detail that you go into in something like that is, it is wonderful. Yes, it's magic, but behind all magic, there's a magician.
The two Japanese structures that we ended up with, the larger one is known as an azumaya. It was the kind of contemplation pavilion that a retired Japanese samurai would build. By the way, the azumaya has what's called an irimoya roof. And there are 2 tons of tiles we got in Hiroshi's hometown, Shingu in southern Japan. Most of the work goes into the roof of the Japanese building. It takes years. It took 2 summers to do the roof. It's the most important part. The smaller building, which is known as a hogyo, and that was a very early Japanese form of tea house, probably 16th century, 17th century, and it looks out over the borrowed scenery, the shake, as the Japanese call it, of the fields and forests and hills in the distance. And it became very much a part of the garden, really almost my favorite part of the garden. And in a sense, gardens really are not just physical and natural, they're metaphysical. They're at times transcendent, they're incorporeal. They just have an extra numinous spirit there if they've been successful, and you sense that. And it is a way to connect at a different level than one normally does.
But I feel that when I see something that is really good, it affects me so much that it improves me, too. It makes me better. Not only physically better if I was ill, but a better person. And I think, if you really want to be more mystical about it, I actually believe that a beautiful garden, like a beautiful landscape or a beautiful picture. I don't really believe in God and the afterlife at all, but when I am moved by something like that, I do begin to think there really must be some other thing like the Lord who is making me feel like this. It couldn't just have happened by evolution.
When the prince of one of the English royal family came here once for lunch, and the Lamau Bay police practiced convoying him from Lamau Bay to here. 50 times they did it with sirens blazing all the way. They had to practice the road from the mairie to here.
The next morning he said, well, then we're going to go around the garden properly now. All this is over, the Duchess and all that. I don't really remember after that very much, except me wandering slightly bewildered round the garden with his sheet in my hand, telling me which way to go.
The experience he wanted people to have was the one that he wanted them to have, not something the other way around. For instance, if you come from the Japanese pavilion up through the ravine, and then finally you get to that huge, complicated garden, the Tsuba, you really have a cumulative effect, which is entirely different than if you do it the other way around.
My favorite part of the garden is the woodland garden, which has beautiful flowers all summer long, but early in spring they're marvelous.
prior to getting to the ravine, we'd turned the woodland into a garden. The woodland was a mess, so it took us, I think, about 7 years to slowly but surely clear the woodland. Of course, the things that really liked the woodland were the primulas. They come from the most fascinating parts of the world. The high elevations in Asia and China, Sikkim and Tibet, Nepal.
So in the 19th century, the whole area of plant hunting, plant collecting for medicinal and trade reasons became more and more important. There was a great mania for collecting plants. I mean, this is something you see also at Quatre Bras, because Frank Cabot himself, of course, went and collected plants in the Himalayas.
And when one is in the mountains of China and walking up rivers in China, it looks as if a landscape architect has come along and planted this plant as far as the eye can see on either side of the river. It's an extraordinary thing. I find that seeing a plant in nature helps one place it in the garden. You've all heard of the primrose path. Well, they are a promiscuous lot. They tend to crossbreed and interbreed, so you get all these fascinating hybrids. And in fact, to our great surprise, we discovered a new hybrid in this garden, and Reynald, the head honcho in the garden, who's worked with me since he was 17 years old for the last 27 years, came up one day and he said, "This one looks different." And sure enough, he was right.
Et on voit ici la Primula Reynald. Sa particularité, c'est que c'est la couleur, c'est magenta, ce qui n'existe pas. Et deuxième chose, c'est qu'elle est stérile. Elle ne produit pas de graines. À ma connaissance, il n'y en a nulle part ailleurs. Au Québec et dans le monde, probablement. Après plusieurs démarches, elle a été homologuée. Elle s'appelle maintenant Primula X Freundei Reynald. Ben, c'est M. Cabot qui a décidé d'y donner ce nom-là. C'est très gentil de sa part parce que moi, tout ce que j'ai fait, j'ai aucun mérite. Là, je l'ai juste trouvé. Il y a des plantes rares dans le jardin. Le Cypripedium acolis, qui est une plante rare. On en avait juste un spécimen qui était une grosse masse ensemble. Et puis, il y a une dizaine d'années environ, on a décidé de la diviser. Sauf que l'année suivante, on en avait perdu presque au-dessus de la moitié. C'est aussi la nature, hein? On faut vivre avec ça. On ne peut pas décider qu'est-ce qui va survivre et qu'est-ce qui va mourir. On n'est pas maître. On est juste les exécutants, on essaie de faire le mieux qu'on peut en pensant qu'on fait le mieux.
You emerge from the woods and you come out above the swimming pool and see Charlevoix once again. You've left Asia behind you and you're looking at French Canada once more. And then there's a perimeter road, a carriage trail that runs below the swimming pool down towards the vegetable garden. This is my wife's domain. She's in charge of the vegetables, designing the vegetable plots, making sure that they're what they should be. And I've been allowed to plant some perennials. And she's now limited me from planting any more perennials because they think they threaten her vegetables. But as far as I'm concerned, there's no such thing as too much delphinium.
Everybody has to have a garden, and it's part of life. You have to have vegetables. When I first met Frank, we went camping, and that was one of the most wonderful parts of the world, the nature. And we all try to save it and, you know, keep things from being developed. That's why we kept this property. And so it's always been our desire to keep things from being spoiled and to save them as they are in the farms or the land in the woods.
De l'autre côté de la rivière, du côté ouest de la rivière, la seigneurie qui s'étendait de la rivière donc jusqu'à celle des éboulements, à peu près à Cap-aux-Oins, était la propriété, ou plus ou moins la propriété, de John Nairn. La seigneurie portait le nom de Murray Bay. Sur le site de la seigneurie de Murray Bay, il y avait nécessairement un manoir. Et malheureusement, et ça c'est très malheureux, il a été démoli en 1960. On m'a ensuite dit qu'il était dans un tel état, étant en grande partie construit en bois, qu'on ne pouvait pas le garder. Ce que, évidemment, je n'ai pas cru, parce qu'on peut toujours restaurer une pièce. C'est la région du centre commercial de la Malbaie. Et je crois que la perte du manoir Nairn est une des grandes pertes culturelles de la Malbaie.
When things became available because of neglect or the family was selling out, he occasionally would buy them and created an organization called Héritage Charlevoix to preserve them. And the Moulin de la Rémie in Baie-Saint-Paul and the bakery that goes with it is the biggest one. So those buildings and that patrimoine feeling that he valued so, he actually was very actively involved in preserving. He cared tremendously about the view shed, always. He worries about what Pointe-à-Pitre looks like from the Cap-à-l'Aigle side, and he also knows that when he builds a silo and a barn on the Cap-à-l'Aigle side, that everybody in Pointe-à-Pitre is going to be criticizing him. And he really spoke for the patrimoine and cared deeply about it, so deeply that at one point we had a countryside exchange in which experts came from all over Europe, mostly, to discuss what was going to happen and what Charlevoix was going to look like in 50 years. And one of the things that I know that he remembered was driving in his mother's car, father's car, up the valley of the Murray River, the Malbaie River, and seeing the kerosene lamps in the houses in the evening of the farmers who had one horse and one plow and were living a very old-fashioned and beautiful way. Now there's an appreciation of the old ways that's returning, and people are actually actively valuing those cultural artifacts that make this landscape so fantastic.
Well, you know, you go to all these efforts to create something, and people, friends would come and visit and enjoy it, and they've sort of intimated, well, we'd like to be able to come regularly and come and take a look. At the same time, there's a wonderful local nature center up here that Centre Écologique de Port-au-Saumon, which is one of the leading nature centers in French Canada. And the man who was running it one day came to me and he said, could we have a benefit at your place? And we said, oh, sure.
On s'est rendu chez M. Cabot, et puis j'avais apporté les plans, les devis de ce qui avait été réalisé. Et puis je déroule ça devant lui, puis je lui montre. Il dit, quoi, ça existe à quelques kilomètres de chez nous, puis j'ignore ça, moi. Donc là, il dit, est-ce que je peux vous aider d'une forme ou d'une autre, là? Il a été décidé qu'on ferait un festival des sciences de la nature dans Charlevoix. Et puis, M. Cabot a décidé, lui, d'offrir son jardin pour faire la première visite de son jardin, les 80.
I thought that maybe there'd be 123 old English ladies who would come, and Anglophones, and, you know, but when the time came, there were 2,000 cars parked along the main road in either direction. Everybody wanted to come.
Parce qu'il avait annoncé ça dans les médias, à la radio, à la télévision. Il n'y a que ça qui a fait un succès. Parce que les autres conférenciers, là, ils faisaient chaud. Les gens aimaient bien mieux être en costume de bain avec une bière froide dans le gazon que d'aller écouter les scientifiques faire des conférences. Mais l'ouverture des jardins a réussi, elle. Mais elle a fini à queue de poisson, c'est ça qui est le pire.
The joy that those people had, it was a madhouse. They were thrilled with what they saw. They were running around the rope bridges. They were up and down the ravine. They were all over the place. It was chaos. But obviously, it was exciting.
Il y avait tellement de monde, vous savez, comme à l'Expo 67, là. Puis on était rendu 6 heures du soir. Le responsable m'a dit, regarde, ça monte. Il dit, ça coupe ici. Il restait à peu près 800 à 900 personnes. Ils ont crié. Ils ont dit, nous autres, ça fait 6 heures qu'on dit, les autres, ça fait 4 heures. Moi, je viens du lac Saint-Jean, puis...
So we then decided, well, next year, let's have a series of maybe 4 Saturdays a summer, and we'll control this, and people will buy tickets, and they can come. And those would be guided tours, 15 people. And they did it beautifully, and they worked it out in a way so that you wouldn't see any other group when you were in the garden, so it became a marvelous experience.
One of my very good friends was discussing the issue of the public versus private garden with me, and she said, no, don't ever make it a public garden. Always keep it a private garden. And I said, why are you so intense about this? And she said, there's a frisson of voyeurism that people really like. They know when they look at the house from the outside and they see the little privé sign on the steps that there's a life going on in there, and that is important.
And all of this generated money for the Centre Écologique. And now I think it adds up to $75,000, $80,000 a year towards their budget. So that's the rationale for visiting. And I think also it's right, because if we create all this and nobody sees it except us, that's a little selfish. And I think gardens like to be seen. I think they enjoy it. And they do better because they know people coming to see them.
It's worth having this garden for that reason, because it would be wrong to have it just all for ourselves.
My father thought of it as a work of art, and art is supposed to make a difference in people's lives. And what I love about the public days at Centre Écologique is the fact that people who come to visit in those large groups, by the time they're finished 3 hours later, their lives have been changed. They've moved from one place to another, and often it's a very moving and important place. And to me, that's the power of art. If great art can move people, the more it can be sustained, the more important it is for life, because we all need art to live.
Si ça a apporté le goût à des gens de faire un jardin, même à plus petite échelle, c'est pas grave, ça. Ça n'a pas d'importance. C'est qu'il y ait le goût. Si ça donne le goût à une personne de plus, tant mieux.
La visite des jardins, les 80, est très bénéfique pour porter les gens à protéger l'environnement. Ils sont tellement émerveillés là, que, rendus, ils ne peuvent pas faire autrement qu'avoir augmenté leur amour de la nature, puis ce qu'on l'aime, on le défend.
With the environmental catastrophe, which we're told is engulfing us, more and more artists in different disciplines are looking at ecology and the environment and outdoor settings and natural materials as a way of expressing themselves, because this seems to be the most urgent aspect of human experience at the moment, our relationship with the planet. And of course, making a garden is perhaps a human being's most intimate relationship with the planet, because it's a one-to-one relationship. It's a physical relationship. Your hands in the soil are an embrace of sorts.
And the fascinating thing is that as you work with plants as a gardener, you relate to the plants. You become attached to them. You are pleased when they show their pleasure by blooming their heads off or doing the right thing or getting bigger. You're disappointed when they disappoint you. So there's always this personal, emotional relationship with all the different species. You want to make sure that such and such is doing all right. So there is this fragility in the setting, and you have to consciously think about, I'm afraid, the whole time, whether it's right or not, or whether it needs adjustment or attention.
I will die when I can't garden anymore. Well, I mean, we know it now, don't we, from hospices and things, that, I mean, patients really feel better if you have a garden.
We went to visit a garden in California because we'd been told it was a wonderful garden, and it was all cactuses and dry plants and things. And Frank didn't like them at all, but when he went to see it, he was so impressed. The best beautiful garden he'd ever seen. And a lovely lady who was owned it he said, what's going to happen to this garden when you can no longer do it? And she said, well, I don't know, because my children aren't interested. And so I jokingly said to Frank as we left, why don't you start a garden conservancy? Because I'd just become on the board of the Nature Conservancy, and it seemed like a good idea to save things. And they gave him this idea, and he went, and then he worked with that with lots of other people. And it was a big job, and it's been very successful.
And then it spread all over the country, and in every city or state, there would be a little committee, all of whom were mostly ladies, of course, eating out of Frank's hand, absolutely adoring him. He just had a very broad view, and he was an enormous influence, do you know? Really.
Gardens are very difficult to save. They're not like buildings. They're never the same one season to the next. Suddenly, global warming can happen, and we should be growing palm trees in Lama Bay as opposed to thuya hedges. And if the genius of gardens are to be appreciated, we need to save the best ones so that people can learn from them.
Well, the future of this place, I hope, will be able to keep going as long as possible, and people will look after it.
My parents often wondered, I think, whether one of their children would be around to take care of these things after they were gone. And my mission in life right now is to make sure that this thing gets preserved and goes on.
Moi, ce que je souhaiterais pour le jardin, c'est qu'il perdure dans le temps, puis que les gens reconnaissent tout l'apport qu'il a donné pour l'horticulture au Québec aussi. C'est très important, ça.
I think he wasn't interested in just being a rich man. And some of these other people were. It was a competitive thing. And that didn't interest Frank, really. He was much, much more an educationalist than that. He wanted to teach people and encourage them. But he also just absolutely loved it. Do you know, he had a passion. He had a passion.
I think everyone has a garden within them, and it's a way of expressing one's creativity, and it's just the most satisfying exercise. It really is the purest of human pleasures. And in the wintertime, one can think about it and plan changes. And I found that, in the end, a good garden has a soul, especially if it's made by an individual. And I think that's very important, because if you have somebody else do it for you, it really isn't your garden. It doesn't have that quality that a personal garden has. There's a wonderful word called numinous, which means you sense a numinous spirit in the garden. You sense the fact that somebody has done this, somebody's particular psychological peculiarities are expressed in this place. And if you're sensitive and open as you go through it, and expose yourself to what the garden has to tell you, you'll get a lot more out of it. So I'm happiest when I see someone sitting quietly on a bench and just drinking in the sights and sounds around them. Gardeners, I suppose, are all trying to recreate the Garden of Eden. There's a wonderful saying that the senses are the gateway to the soul. And I really believe that. And I think I'm never happier if I think that someone's soul has been touched by their experience here at Quatre Bras.